England's war with France had been a long and expensive struggle. It had taken place on land and sea, and it had extended to several continents. As a result, the British Crown had built up an enormous public debt. Therefore, no sooner had victory celebrations ended than the government in London began pressing for new taxes to replenish empty coffers. With residents of England already heavily taxed, Parliament turned its attention to the colonies. Their economies had grown and prospered under the protection of the British Crown, and had benefited directly from the recent war. In the past, England had asked its colonists to pay only duties assigned to regulate trade. Now, however, officials suggested that perhaps it was time to levy taxes to raise revenues, even if the colonists were not directly represented in the English Parliament. In 1765, Parliament approved the controversial Stamp Act, taxing the colonists by obliging them to purchase a government stamp for which simple transactions as buying a newspaper, filing a will, or selling a piece of property. Extensive protests forced the law to be repealed, but it was followed by other revenue measures that intensified debate. British soldiers and sailors used to maintain order became objects of scorn, and the king's troops were frequently attacked. When Parliament passed the Tea Act in 1773, suspicious local leaders saw the offer of cheap tea as a device to trick the colonists into accepting the principle of taxation by Parliament. Colonists vowed not to purchase English tea, and even threw boxes of tea into the Boston harbor. In 1774, an irate Parliament responded with a series of coercive acts, prompting colonial leaders to organize a Continental Congress that would work on the American response to the intrusive British legislation. British troops met armed resistance when they attempted to secure government powder supplies in Lexington, Massachusetts in April 1775, and in July 1776, the Continental Congress voted to declare independence from Great Britain. As participants or observers, African Americans were close to all these important events leading up to the American Revolution. They witnessed firsthand the mounting pressures for an armed revolt against the strongest empire on earth. During a Stamp Act protest in Wilmington, North Carolina, for example, the royal governor sent food and drink in an effort to placate white demonstrators. Not willing to be bought off, the crowd immediately broke into heads of the barrels of punch and let them run the street. According to a first-hand account, they refused to roast the ox offered them by the governor. Instead, they put its head on display in the pillory and gave the carcass to the Negroes who were looking on. Equiano was working as a slave on a small vessel in the Caribbean when word reached America that such protests had brought an end to the Stamp Act. He recalled sailing into Charleston Harbor at night and seeing the town illuminated. The guns were fired, and bonfires and other demonstrations of joy shown on account of repeal of the Stamp Act. Crispus Attucks, son of a black man and an Indian woman, played a central role in the Boston Massacre of 1770, in which British redcoats killed 5 colonists. Described as 6 feet 2 inches high, with short curled hair, Attucks had run away from his master in Framingham, Massachusetts, in 1750. 20 years later, at age 47, he was working as a sailor out of the Bahamas aboard a boat bound from Boston to North Carolina. On the evening of March 5, 1770, Attucks played a leading role in the bloody skirmish on King Street. When attorney John Adams, later the second president of the United States, defended the British soldiers at their trial, he argued they had been provoked by a mob made up of a motley rabble of saucy boys, Negroes, and mulattoes, Irish teagues, slang for Irishmen, and outlandish jack tars, sailors from foreign ports. Attucks, he told the court, appears to have undertaken to be the hero of the night, and to lead this army with banners, to form them in the first place in Dock Square, and march them to King Street with their clubs. Andrew, a slave witness who testified at the same trial, recalled seeing Attucks and his band arrive on the scene, where a bitter scuffle was already in progress. The new contingent was shouting loudly and crying, "Damn them, they dare not fire. We are not afraid of them." According to Andrew, one of the people, a stout man with a long cordwood stick, whom he later identified as Addicks, threw himself in and made a blow at the officer, crying out, "Kill the dogs, knock them over." Similarly, John Adams argued that the stout mulatto fellow waded into the fray and with one hand took hold of a bayonet and with the other knocked the man down. Addicks' actions cost him his life, according to published accounts. He was the first to fall, killed on the spot, 2 balls entering his breast. When Boston staged an elaborate public funeral for the martyrs killed in the clash, all the bells tolled in solemn peal. Throughout the town, in subsequent years, colonial radicals invoked the name of Crispus Attucks as the first person who had given his life for the patriot cause. Other African Americans would risk their lives even before the Declaration of Independence. When Paul Revere summoned the Minutemen to oppose British troops at Concord in Lexington in April 1775, a number of black men living in Massachusetts responded to the call. They included Cato Stedman, Cuff Whitmore, and Cato Boardman from Cambridge, John Potama and Isaiah Bioman from Stoneham, Peter Salem from Braintree, Prince Easterbrooks from Lexington, Pompey from Brooklyn, and David Lamson, an elderly mulatto who had fought in the French and Indian War. Later the same year, at the Battle of Bunker Hill, Cuff Whitmore and Peter Salem again saw action, along with nearly 20 other African Americans. Salem Poor, a black freeman from Andover, fought so bravely that some of the white colleagues later petitioned that this brave and gallant soldier deserved a reward since he had behaved like an experienced officer throughout the conflict. Crispus Attucks had become a remembered figure in American history, and a picture of Peter Salem at Bunker Hill had appeared on a U.S. postage stamp. But there were other black men and women from the decade before the Revolution who are less well known and who deserve great recognition. Individually and collectively, they were involved in their own struggle for liberty. They faced tremendous odds and they took enormous risks. Loyal to the principle of freedom, they listened to the competing rhetoric of white patriots and the British Crown. Would either side in the mounting debate include African Americans as free and equal members of society? Unfortunately, the response turned out to be no. But during the decade before 1776 and the decade after as well, this fateful answer remained uncertain. After all, there were moral and logical arguments why Englishmen on one or both sides of the Atlantic might finally decide to renounce race slavery. One thing, a few whites, led by pioneering Quakers such as John Woolman and Anthony Benezet, were showing an interest in abolishing the institution of slavery, an idea that enslaved African Americans had supported unanimously for more than a century. Not only were notions of human equality beginning to gain favor, but politicians and strategists on both sides of the Atlantic were anxious to appear consistent in arguing over British liberties. White colonists who claimed they were being enslaved by British tyranny were frequently reminded of their hypocrisy. How could they pretend to be advocates for the liberties of mankind, one critic asked, when they were trampling on the sacred, natural rights and privileges of Africans at the same moment? How indeed, wondered Abigail Adams in Boston. She reminded her husband John Adams the white colonists were preparing to fight for the same liberty that we are daily robbing and plundering from those who have as good a right to freedom as we have. Black colonists were ready to fight for their own freedom. They knew they might gain from any dissent that divided the whites who dominated their lives. In Charleston, in October 1765, white demonstrators, calling themselves the Sons of Liberty, took to the streets to oppose the Stamp Act. They chanted, "Liberty, liberty," and displayed banners reading "Liberty" and "No Stamp Act." They even paraded through town with a British flag, upon which they had written the word "Liberty." A local grand jury protested that slaves, encouraged by such actions, were soon taking the streets at all times in the night and gathering in large numbers on Sundays, much to the distress of whites. When the wife of a merchant overheard two slaves discussing a possible uprising on the night before Christmas, authorities took steps to prevent the usual firing guns by way of rejoicing on Christmas Eve. Though armed guards patrolled day and night for weeks, one planner reported that this did not prevent some brave African Americans from shouting out in public for liberty. Even distant events could provide rays of hope. In 1772, a judge in London ruled, in the well-publicized case of a slave named Somerset, that it was illegal to hold anyone in bondage in England, regardless of race. When word of this stunning decision reached the southern colonies, it created a predictable stir among enslaved workers. Virginia newspapers soon carried ads for black runaways who had disappeared in hopes of securing passage to England. Bacchus, for example, had headed for the coast to board a vessel for Great Britain. According to his owner, due to the knowledge he had of Somerset case, Phyllis Wheatley spoke for all blacks in 1774 when she observed that God had placed a love of freedom and a dislike of oppression in every human breast. We Africans, though enslaved, are no different, the young writer asserted. The same principle lives in us. These were not empty words. The previous year, 4 slaves in Boston, seeking independence for blacks in Massachusetts, had petitioned the colonial legislature. Whether out of irony or flattery, they began by stating, "We expect great things from men who have made such a noble stand against the designs of their fellowmen to enslave them." They asked for the right to leave the province as soon as they could earn enough money to buy passage to some part of the coast of Africa where we propose a settlement. At the same time, other black New Englanders, both slave and free, were petitioning successive governors, hoping to induce the British Crown to show sympathy to their cause. In 1774, African Americans in Massachusetts reminded Governor Thomas Gage, "We have in common with all other men a natural right to our freedoms." They asked him to abolish slavery and to provide them with some part of the unimproved land belonging to the province for a settlement. In the southern colonies, with enslavement more widespread and black literacy generally forbidden, the chances for a petition or public appeal remained slim, unless it came from an outspoken visitor. In the tumultuous spring of 1775, an African-born preacher named David visited Charleston. The young evangelist spoke to a private gathering of black and white Christians, and he refused to utter gentle pieties. Instead, David assured his audience that God would send deliverance to the Negroes from the power of their masters as he freed the children of Israel from Egyptian bondage. White listeners suspected that he meant to raise rebellion amongst the Negroes, and David had to flee the town rapidly to avoid being hanged. If enslaved Africans were finally to win deliverance in 1775, perhaps it would be with the aid of British forces. When shots were fired at Lexington in April, and later at Bunker Hill, blacks like Peter Salem joined the Patriot forces, and eventually thousands more would follow during the course of the Revolutionary War. But many more, particularly in the South, saw the British as their likely ally, as court testimony reveals. In April, Thomas Jeremiah, a free black who worked as a pilot in Charleston Harbor, took aside a slave dock worker named Sambo and told him there was a great war coming soon. He urged Sambo to join the soldiers because the impending war was to help the poor Negroes. Several months later, Jeremiah was accused of smuggling guns from a British warship to slaves in the Charleston vicinity. Fearful of black rebellion, Patriot leaders in control of the town had Jeremiah publicly hanged and then burned as a brutal example to other African American freedom fighters. In other southern colonies, black hopes for successful armed rebellion also ran high during 1775, and white fears of a slave uprising proved equally strong. In eastern North Carolina, rumors of revolt were widespread. When a plot was discovered in early June, the Patriot committees of safety rounded up scores of African Americans, many of them were armed. Suspected slaves were severely whipped in public, and some had their ears cut off. All those who spoke to their captors told a similar story. According to Colonel John Simpson, they said they were to rise up on the night of July 8th, destroy the local community, and march toward the back country, where they expected to be met by armed British officials and settled in a free government of their own. Blacks in Maryland had similar hopes of overthrowing their bondage. Their bold talk and actions infuriated the Patriot leaders in Dorchester County, who finally moved to confiscate their weapons, and one day they claimed to have taken about 80 guns, some bayonets, swords, and so on. As 1775 unfolded, Black aspirations for freedom and English desires to frighten white radicals in America seemed to coincide. "Things are coming to that crisis," wrote British Commander Thomas Gage in June, "that we must avail ourselves of every resource, even to raise the Negroes in our cause." This practical alliance emerged most dramatically in Virginia. The royal governor in Williamsburg, Lord Dunmore, had hinted in May his intention of proclaiming all the Negroes free who should join him. By autumn, the Patriots had forced him to take refuge on a vessel from His Majesty's Navy, and Dunmore was sailing the coastline, encouraging Black Virginians to escape to British ships. In November, he issued a proclamation emancipating any slave who would join his forces, and Black Virginians flocked to his banner. Within a month, he had more than 300 persons enrolled in his Ethiopian regiment, with the words "Liberty to Slaves" emblazoned across their uniforms. Patriot leaders and Virginia planters expressed deep concern over the success of Dunmore's proclamation. Up and down the Chesapeake, as far away as Georgia, enslaved blacks were making desperate efforts to elude their owners and come under the protective wing of the Royal Navy. On November 30th, the Virginia Gazette spoke of boatloads of slaves struggling to reach British ships, but not all of them made it. For instance, 2 men and 7 women who had been endeavoring to get to Norfolk in an open boat were apprehended before reaching their destination. When a contingent of blacks in Georgia gathered on Tybee Island near the mouth of the Savannah River, the local committee of safety secretly paid a band of Creek Indians to destroy them before they reach British protection. Likewise, some of the South Carolina runaways who set up camp on Sullivan's Island near Charleston Harbor were hunted down before they could board British ships. Despite the high risk, hundreds of African Americans clambered safely aboard English vessels in the months after Lord Dunmore's proclamation. In late December 1775, George Washington expressed his fear of Dunmore's plan. The Patriot commander wrote that if that man is not crushed by spring, he will become the most formidable enemy America has. His strength will increase as a snowball by rolling it, and faster if some expedient cannot be hit upon to convince the slaves and servants of the impotency of his designs. But during the spring of 1776, it was not General Washington who stopped the dramatic flow of Black Virginians to join Lord Dunmore. Instead, an outbreak of smallpox in the crowded camps finally reduced the tide of hopeful refugees. Had it not been for this horrid disorder, Dunmore wrote in 1776, I could have expected 2,000 blacks with whom I should have had no doubt of penetrating into the heart of this colony. In the preceding months, however, hundreds of African Americans along the Atlantic coast had jumped at the chance for freedom. The dramatic story of Thomas Peters is typical. He had been born in Africa in 1738 among the Yoruba in what is now Nigeria. At age 22, he was kidnapped by slave traders and deported to Louisiana aboard the French ship Henri Quatre. Unwilling to submit to enslavement in a strange land, he was whipped, branded, and shackled. for repeated efforts to gain his freedom. By 1770, he had been sold to William Campbell, a Scotsman living in Wilmington, North Carolina, and a leading member of the Sons of Liberty. In the spring of 1776, when the British sloop Cruzier entered the Cape Fear River, Peters saw his chance. Along with a black friend named Murphy Steele, he escaped to the British and enlisted in a company of black pioneers, made up of slaves from the Cape Fear region. Tom was later joined by his wife, Sally, and their daughter, Clary, born in 1771. Peters and Steele would go on to serve with the British during the Revolution, and after the war, Peters spent time in Canada and England, eventually migrating back to Africa with friends and family shortly before his death in 1792. Scarcely 3 months after Thomas Peters left William Campbell, Thomas Jefferson drafted the Declaration of Independence. In the Revolutionary War that followed, numerous slaves took advantage of the continuing turmoil to seek their freedom, but most were disappointed. The new nation that was born out of a struggle over independence would fail to honor, in its Constitution, the stirring words of Jefferson's declaration that all men are created equal. The vast majority of the country's 500,000 African Americans were still living in the South and still bearing the yoke of slavery in 1776. In the 19th century, another strong armed force would appear along the Atlantic seaboard that could prompt hundreds of expectant blacks to risk it all. Once again, they would run away from their masters with the hope of receiving weapons and obtaining a chance to fight for their own freedom. But it would take more than 3 long generations before the expectations for freedom raised by the American Revolution could be met through the bloodshed of the Civil War.